Chapter 21. Cam. Cam and his family hadn't yet reached Petaluma Boulevard when 4 Chinese Chengdu J-20 fighters screamed overhead, heading to intercept any U.S. planes trying to molest the bombers that trailed them onto U.S. soil. Minutes later, the Griffins were knocked to the ground as the trailing bombers released their payloads onto the green zones. As they huddled next to a parked car, Layla began to cry, and Jen pulled her in close. Taylor saw his sister being comforted by their mother and slid closer. Soon, Jen had both children wrapped in her arms while her husband stared at the debris, dust, and the smoke that rose over 100 feet into the sky on the eastern horizon. "We need a break here," Cam muttered under his breath. The day had started out decent, but had devolved into a real doozy as the hours passed. With the night barely an hour and a half out, he felt as though a vice-like pressure was squeezing his head between its relentless, crushing weight. When it was clear the falling debris wouldn't reach their position, he got to his feet and looked back towards City Hall. Screw it, he thought to himself. If selling himself to save his family was what he had to do, then he'd do it. "Let's get back to the city building," he said, climbing back on his bicycle. "What are we doing?" Jen asked as she unfolded her arms from around the 2 kids like an angel unfurling its protective wings. "I need to get you 3 to my parents, and I need help," he confided, knowing his wife would recognize his confession as an indicator he really did need a lifeline. As they rode back up to City Hall, Cam didn't bother shielding the kids from the grisly scene in the parking lot. If what he thought was true, the country was about to be occupied by China and North Koreans. Taylor and Layla were sadly in for worse visual atrocities than the 5 men on the ground at City Hall. Much worse. At first, he didn't see either of the Green Berets outside the building. The crowd seemed to have thinned, and several men were wrapping the dead Koreans in sheets and blankets, while others stood by with wheelbarrows. He couldn't imagine where they planned on taking the corpses. Maybe they planned on dumping them in a ditch away from town for the coyotes to take care of. As he was about to ask someone where the army men were, he spotted them, standing with 5 other guys, all armed and serious, staring at the smoke in the distance. "Hang tight here, babe," he told his wife, after making sure she was in control of the kids. He wove his way through the remaining people in the lot and headed for the side of the building where Mike and Tim were engaged in an intense conversation with the other men. Mike stood with his hands on his hips, and he alternated between talking and scanning the area as if he wasn't fully comfortable with his surroundings. During one of those scans, he caught sight of Cam's cautious approach and waved, beckoning him over before he turned back to the group and spoke, pointing a finger at each man. Cam slowed as he drew close enough to hear. "And this isn't going away," Mike was saying. "I'm not totally sure what just happened, but I'm guessing these Koreans didn't want anyone near the highway when they came through. When Roberta couldn't help with the evacuation and we smoked half their team, they cleared the green zone the old-fashioned way, with ordnance." Shaking his head, he turned to Cam. "Your family all good?" Cam nodded and shot a quick glance towards the massive bombing that had just taken place not all that far from City Hall. "You said you could make sure my wife and kids were taken care of. That you could get them to my parents' place with some food." Mike's hands came up to rest on the buttstock of his rifle that hung off his front, barrel down, suspended by a nylon sling. "Bro, that was our first offer. Things just changed big time if you hadn't noticed." "I noticed," Cam said, begrudgingly. He was about to continue when 2 fighter jets flashed overhead in a westerly direction. Mike squinted into the late afternoon sky. "That was only 2. Weren't there 4 going in?" "Yep. Maybe our boys got the other 2, Tim suggested. "I sure hope so." Mike turned his attention back to Cam. "Now you want help?" "I want to help, but I need to get my family somewhere safe first." "Come on." Mike took off towards the city hall. Cam followed the burly man inside the building and through several darkened hallways until they arrived at an office, lit only by a small candle. Inside, a woman, the same woman he'd seen Mike talking to earlier that day. She sat at a desk, papers covering its top. Her hair was mussed, and she looked exhausted, both in appearance and by her sluggish mannerisms. "I need you to take care of some people for us. 2 kids and a woman," Mike announced, not bothering to introduce anyone. Cam stepped forward and extended a hand. "I'm Cameron, and they'd be my wife and 2 kids. The woman rose from her seat, halfway, hesitantly taking Cam's hand as she blinked at Mike. "What are you asking me to do?" Her voice sounded dry and raspy, and he saw her swallow hard. Mike wrapped a meaty hand around Cam's shoulder as if they were good friends. "Cam here was a Marine. He's seen the worst of the worst, and we need his help. His family's with him, and they don't even live in the state, so we need a safe place for them to stay for a couple days until I can sort something else out." Based on her response, she had not been expecting to be asked to foster a family. I guess Roger shouldn't mind if it's only for a couple of nights." "Good. You guys need to leave for home, now," Mike urged. She seemed about to protest, but only for a moment. Instead, she reached into her drawer and took out a small clutch. Cam watched, wondering what she had in the tiny purse that was of any use these days. He assumed she carried the accoutrement more out of habit than functionality. The only item from the past that would be remotely useful now would be a house key, and that could be dropped into a pants pocket. "I appreciate this," Cam told her as she rounded the desk. She gave him a strained smile in response. Outside the building, he waved a hand to get Jen's attention. When she looked over, he motioned her to him while Mike walked back to the 5 men who had remained standing next to the side of the building. Mike walked over and pointed at Alex and Manny. "You 2 are on escort duty. Make sure that woman and those 2 kids get to Roberta's place and get in safe, then haul ass back to the warehouse." When Jen reached Cam's side, she glanced at him, at the woman who stood beside him, and then at the group of men. "What's going on, Cam?" "Don't worry, hon. I got you and the kids a place to sleep. You're going with this woman." He stopped as he realized he didn't know her name. "I'm sorry," he said, redirecting his attention to the woman. "Mike didn't introduce us earlier. What's your name again?" "Roberta. I'm the city manager," she said, handing Cam a small slip of paper with her address stenciled on one side. He turned back to his wife, who didn't appear in the least bit pleased with what she felt was about to happen. "Roberta is the city manager, and she's willing to put you and the kids up for the night," he explained, a weak smile creasing his face as his wife's face darkened. "And where will you be?" she asked, her tone letting him know she didn't approve of his proposition. "I'll be along a little later. These army guys need help assessing the damage caused by the bombing." "We're not going anywhere without you, Cameron Griffin," Jen said firmly. "What is even going on in that head of yours? You're going to leave your family and run off to play army? Get your bike and let's get going. We need to find a place to sleep." He wanted to yell at her, to take her by the arm, lead her away from the group of people and make her understand their dire situation, but he held his tongue and stayed his hand. Their marriage was built on mutual respect for one another, not only in the mental sense, but in word and deed as well. They never fought in front of their children, and when they did quarrel, it rarely lasted long. Cam approached disagreement resolution with his wife in one way. He assumed he had a certain number of days left on Earth, in the upright position anyway. If he fought and argued for 2 or 3 days over some trivial matter, that was 2 or 3 days of his limited time on Earth with his best friend he'd lose. Pride was more easily swallowed when life was kept in the proper perspective. Instead, he wrapped his arms around his wife, even though she didn't reciprocate at first. He lowered his head into her hair near her ear and whispered, "We can't go east right now. The neighborhoods are probably burning and littered with bodies. I'm doing the best here, Jen." His voice wavered with his last statement as a feeling of helplessness threatened to overwhelm him. He'd been in situations where he'd fully expected to die, but being powerless to safeguard his family aroused a roiling, rancid storm in his belly, the likes of which he'd never experienced in combat. "Babe, you have to take the kids and go. I'll be along shortly, I promise. Please don't push back on this." He held her tighter as he felt her body convulse as a wave of sobs passed through her. Cam could feel his own eyes welling with the pressure that always preceded an emotional release. He pushed back, struggling to control his tears and harness the raw emotions that swept through him. He didn't want to be seen crying by the Green Berets, or anyone else other than his wife, for that matter. He hid his face in his wife's hair a second longer before pulling back to allow the cool, early evening air to dry what little moisture had been able to steal its way into his eyes. He blinked the tears back, quickly, staring down as Jen lifted her beautiful face to his. "Promise me you'll be back," was all she said as he gave her forehead a light kiss. Mike interrupted their moment. "Gotta go, guys. It's gonna be dark soon and only 2 of us have nods." It was true they'd taken the KPA men's nods, but with no helmet or crown mounts, they were reduced to using the knockoffs by holding them to their face, which meant they couldn't shoot with them. The KPA nods would only be useful in a defensive position, which they weren't involving themselves in at the moment. Cam gave his wife one last bear hug before releasing her. "I love you, Mrs. Griffin." "Promise?" she repeated in an almost whisper. "I promise." The streets of Petaluma were dark, but the sky to the east glowed an eerie orange as entire neighborhoods burned after the Chinese bombing of the designated green zones. The orange glow, Cam could see, was, in fact, hundreds of homes burning and destroyed by ordnance from the bombers. With no PG&E crews able to shut off gas mains, the fires raged in a grotesque reenactment of the San Bruno pipeline explosion when a 30-inch natural gas line ruptured. The explosion brought raging flames into the Crestmore residential neighborhood just 2 miles west of the San Francisco International Airport on September 9, 2010, at roughly 1811 hours. He remembered the San Bruno pipeline explosion all too vividly and swallowed hard, thinking about the similarities as he paddled behind the Green Berets and the 2 Middle Eastern brothers he'd been introduced to. They rode quietly through the streets of Petaluma, only the faint hum of their bike tires disturbing an otherwise nearly silent evening. Everything felt off to Cam as they rode. The fires burning and the absence of sirens gave him a sickening sensation in the pit of his stomach. Even in the Middle East, sirens had sounded after an IED destroyed part of a convoy, killing warfighters and civilians alike. His mind drifted to his family for a second, and then to the people in the fires. It reminded him of a t-shirt he'd once bought. The garment had a snow-capped mountain printed on its front, and the words, "Expect to self-rescue," were stenciled in 2-inch letters under the image. He gulped again at the thought of how many people would die waiting for police or fire assistance, never lifting a finger to aid themselves or their neighbors. He didn't fault these people. Society as a whole was to blame. With the mechanisms in place for nearly every conceived emergency, people had only to pick up their cell phone and call 911. 3 simple presses of a button, and someone else would swoop in and manage all their problems. Only now, the response to those 3 buttons was extinct, like the dinosaurs, a victim of some cataclysmic event. America now boasted several generations of citizens who'd never felt real hardship. Not like those Americans that endured during the 2 great wars, not to mention the Depression. Society in the U.S. was one of access, breeding a population of people who underappreciated how food ended up on their tables and the manner in which their fuels were processed or vehicles built. They had only to slide a credit card and life was delivered in a ready-made package. A wave of terror swept over Cam as he thought about what was about to happen in America with the absence of a power grid. He'd sat in on county meetings while he was a deputy sheriff and listened to the civilian managers talk about how they had overcome a massive long-term power outage. He remembered sitting there, quietly thinking to himself that every plan, initiative, and program they broached would be useless in preventing deaths related to the lack of medical aid, starvation, contaminated water sources, and a litany of other diabolical shortcomings they hadn't even considered. They'd discussed a massive solar flare causing power failures at all levels, and his county's plan was to truck in food from a nearby FEMA storage facility. It was after hearing this that he recused himself from any further meetings with these people who planned for disaster while their heads remained in the clouds or stuffed in other low-light areas. When the Bayat brothers swerved across the street and pulled the bikes to a halt in front of a small strip mall, Cam knew they had arrived. Mike had mentioned that the brothers were friends with the owner of a small sporting goods store that peddled battle wares. The man waited inside his place of business when they arrived and stepped outside, glancing up and down the street as though he expected trouble. The brothers spoke with him briefly before Mike pushed forward. "We good?" he asked Rostam. "Yeah, man. This is Howard. He owns a store." Mike gave Howard a quick nod. "Shall we?" Howard was a tall, thin, balding man. At 52 years old, he had narrow set eyes and a hawkish nose that exaggerated his head movements. His appearance screamed unfriendly, and so far, Cam was of the opinion Howard's looks reflected his personality. Howard stepped aside, holding the door open for the 5 men, and then followed them inside. "Take whatever you want," he said, his voice terse and unfriendly. In the back of the store, Rostam whispered, "The bombs killed some of his family. It was his brother's family, I think. He's really pissed." No one responded. Instead, they began to rummage through the store. Cam found a day pack and a water bottle, and then moved to the back. Rostam told him Howard kept the rifles in a large safe. The safe stood open, as if beckoning him to change his status from unarmed citizen to armed militiaman. Inside the safe, he found several brands of AR platforms chambered in 5.56 millimeter. That was a weapon he would choose, since he was ultra familiar with it and the ammunition was fairly common and easy to find. He settled on a Daniel Defense M4A1 rifle with a 14.5-inch barrel. The weapon was bare bones, having no light, sights, or magazine with it. It was also not California compliant with its 14.5-inch barrel and collapsible stock, which brought a smile to his face. 45 minutes after they arrived, they bid farewell to the reticent Howard, thanking him for his cooperation. Cam now carried a day pack and wore a nylon belt and holster, a Glock 17 pistol nestled nicely at his hip. The rifle was slung and fitted with titanium Troy Industries sights that were not only low profile, but added very little weight to the weapon system. Howard had begrudgingly attached a Leopold Mark VI 1-3 power scope to the rifle before he handed it over to Cam with a scowl. The scope was worth more than the rifle, and Howard's inventory had taken a beating by the nighttime shoppers. Before they left the shop, Mike had spoken in hushed whispers with Howard, then argued, his voice raised, before Howard gave in and scurried to the back of his shop. When he returned, he carried a Gunworks Hammer rifle system, complete with Revic PMR 428 scope and a 30-inch carbon fiber wrap barrel. When Howard handed the long gun to Cam, he hadn't let go right away, and the two stood tugging at the rifle for a very uncomfortable 5 seconds. The rifle was a beast at over 20 pounds and more rifle than Cam had ever worked with in the Marine Corps, but he knew the gun. He just couldn't justify spending $14,000 on a rifle to his wife. From what Cam gathered, the rifle belonged to a Silicon Valley CEO who made the drive up to see Howard in order to avoid being accidentally seen doing business with a gun store by any of his associates. The man traveled out of state to fire the weapon on private ranches where he paid exorbitant prices for private training put on by men who were the 1%ers in the world of long-range shooting instruction. Places like Rifles Only in Texas were just one mecca the rifle Cam carried had seen range time at. Now Cam would use the rifle, not in an environment with timers, buzzers, and metal targets, but in the real world of long-range man-hunting. The 500 rounds Howard gave him wouldn't be flying across manicured grass ranges to punch holes in paper silhouettes. No, it would be fired in battle, just as soon as he could make sure the beast was zeroed correctly. As they walked away from Howard's place, he felt the weight of a pack on his back once again. The pack felt familiar, like an old baseball mitt or a favorite pair of sneakers would feel after wearing dress shoes. He knew the blissful reunion wouldn't last long, and soon his shoulders and back would beg for relief. Until then, his mind drifted back to when he'd been a younger man, surrounded by other young men in a war-torn country where they'd been asked to fight for their country. The truth was, they'd all fought for each other, trying their very best to ensure all who went to war came home. They failed to bring everyone home every single deployment he'd been part of. At the end of the day, there was always an intelligent human on the other side of the battlefield trying his or her best to do what Cam and his Marines were doing. Sometimes, those people overcame the hurdles placed in front of them by the U.S. fighting forces. They'd killed and been killed and enjoyed success and also laid at the base of a fallen friend's memorial and cried. He'd done more living in those few years than he felt he'd done in all his other years of life combined. It was a sad thing with humans that in order to feel alive, they needed to be surrounded by death. It was like a disease, a cancer humanity had not been able to escape since its origins. Maybe if he'd married and had children and never experienced combat and all it had to offer, he would have viewed life through different lenses. It would have meant a relationship with his wife on a clean slate, untainted by the vulgarities of war that brought so many unwanted issues into the beautiful sanctity of a marriage. His children would have enjoyed a father accustomed only to attending to them, playing, teaching, and raising them into fine adults. Instead, they were saddled with a father who took them to the park and would then stare into the distance, his body present, but his mind thousands of miles away in a dark place they couldn't understand. Jen was always glancing back at her husband as they entered a grocery store, watching his body tense as he read the faces of the checkers, trying to discern whether the business was being robbed. She'd done an admirable job of making him feel normal. Even when they'd gone to Disneyland and for 4 full days, his eyes never once stopped searching for a threat. It wasn't that Cam was a bad husband or father. He was human, and there were times his mind wandered back to the Middle East. When he deviated from his current reality, and he wasn't with friends who'd shared in his experiences overseas, the journey always took a dark course through rough waters, leaving him feeling spent and irritable. Now, he was about to jump right back into the same rough waters, and somehow he felt alive. His nerves tingled with the thought of crushing skulls and ghosting bad guys right here at home in America. This time, he would be doing what his great-grandfather had done, something for the survival of his country and everything it stood for. Beginning with the Korean War, Americans had died in wars that, in his opinion, didn't need to be fought. This would be no waste of human life, just so the wealthy elite could get rich off the blood of America's young men and women. There would be no spike in the stock holdings of Boeing or Lockheed Martin. This was going to be a fight by the average man and woman, for the average man and woman. The men rode for half an hour before Mike interrupted his daydreaming and directed them towards a large warehouse. Inside, he introduced Cam to Manny, Alex, and Jim, all of whom were cops like he'd once been. The usual back and forth regarding who they knew in common was set aside for a later, less dire time. Mike got right to briefing everyone present on the evening's mission. There are a few dudes at the storage place about an hour's walk from here. We planned on trying to suck them out so we could kill them, but my guess is if the guy who got away didn't die in someone's backyard, he tipped them off and they moved to an alternate location. Rostam raised a hand. Should Darian and I get out there and set up? Mike shook his head. No. Things went to the next level when we killed those guys. We move as a group now. Don't think because you live here, you're at an advantage. You're not. The guy who is smartest on the battlefield has the advantage. And those Korean dudes out there, they are veteran warriors. They made a mistake trusting Roberta. It won't happen twice. Cam caught Mike's attention. What do you mean they trusted Roberta? He asked, surprised to hear of any connection between the KPA men and his wife's host for the evening. Mike was silent for a moment, and Cam had the feeling the man knew he would be pissed at what he was about to say. They came to her to try to organize what remained of the city's resources to ensure safe passage for their convoy, but she worked them, set them up, or whatever you want to call it, and we killed them. Where did they contact her, Mike? He demanded, his eyes narrowing as a grim picture took shape regarding the safety of his family. Mike grimaced. her house and the office. Cam grabbed his gear, then stopped, dug out the slip of paper, and read the address. He didn't know his way around the city and had no map, so in essence, he had no clue as to where his family was. Mike held up a finger. "Hold up a second." He turned towards Alex. "How quickly can you three get over to Roberta's place?" Alex's brow furrowed in thought. 10 minutes on a bike. "You and Manny take Cam," he ordered. "Bring them all back here. We have room for them." He rubbed the back of his neck and regretted not having taken the obvious into account. He was treading water with his nose barely above the surface and needed help so things like this didn't fall through the crack and cost lives. That was why ODA teams were comprised of 12 men. 12 heads were better than 2, without a doubt.